Let me introduce you to Professor David Widdowson, Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Customs and Excise Studies at Charles Sturt University. He is president of something called the International Network of Customs University, editor-in-chief of the World Customs Journal, a member of the WCO's Picard Advisory Group, and a founding director of the Trusted Trade Alliance. David holds a PhD in customs management and has over 35 years experience in his field of expertise, including 21 years with the Australian Customs Service. His research areas include trade facilitation, regulatory compliance management, risk management, and supply chain security. Very great pleasure to have you here with us in Azerbaijan, David. And you will present a paper on trade facilitation through trusted partnerships. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So now I'm under the rules of the chairman, so I'll do my best to keep to the time. What I want to do is just very briefly give you an overview of a research study that we did. Bit of background: the Australian Customs Service has not had an AEO program to date, so the idea behind this study was to identify the issues relating to the introduction of such a program. And the starting point was not AEO. The starting point was the various terminology that different organisations use to describe this concept of, you see there, regulated shipper, regulated agent, trusted trader, approved exporter, and a number of different government agencies use these terms, particularly in the air cargo industry. So we were looking at the whole concept of these accredited operator schemes. The research objective was not to do work on behalf of government. We were actually developing an industry position. The Australian industry actually sponsored and commissioned the research, so what we were doing was on behalf of industry and not for government. So the idea was to develop the views of industry, which could then be put to the Australian government. And as you can see, we were looking to ensure that Australian industry was able to compete on an equal footing with its overseas counterparts. And most importantly, that last point is looking at a whole of government approach. A little bit of background. Most of us know that partnership programs have been around for quite some time. The Swedish Stairway program, Lars Carlson, who's attending the conference, he was the author of that particular program. And there are different names for these sorts of programs. They exist in a number of different countries, but basically they are focused on traders who have a high record of compliance with customs and can therefore be trusted or considered to be low risk by customs. The security initiatives which followed 9/11 introduced a new category of partnership, if you like. So on the one hand, we had the compliant trader or trusted trader, and they had a high level of compliance with regulatory compliance, trade requirements, etc. They're not trying to cheat the revenue. The authorised economic operator, on the other hand, was then introduced to satisfy the SAFE framework. And I must say that initially it was very clear that the AEO programs that came out of the SAFE framework were only looking at supply chain security. They weren't looking at trade compliance. It was purely in relation to security. Things have changed though. Now over 160 countries have implemented or are in the process of implementing an AEO program of some sort. We have a bit of variety around the world, though. Some actually deliver programs which are based on supply chain security only. Others include trade compliance. Some are focused only on imports, some on exports, and many on both. When we look at the question of mutual recognition, though, and you look at the agreements that have been reached between different countries, you'll see that the main focus there is security, not trade compliance. Very quickly, there's a number of programs that are in operation. The WCO last did an update almost a couple of years ago now, so that one's pretty well out of date. But these that we've undertaken for the study, we've updated those. There's a lot of mutual recognition agreements in place, or being negotiated, or planned for the future. So you can see the way that that's going. There are also parallels to what ICAO is doing. There's a very good publication which is jointly put out by the WCO and ICAO, where they're trying to harmonise the standards which have been put forward by WCO and ICAO. And this is what's happening in relation to air cargo. So here's we've got scenario one. We don't know who the shipper is. We don't know who the forwarder is. And because of that, we have to check the goods, x-ray the goods at the airport prior to uplift onto the aircraft. But then you get scenario two. You still don't know who the shipper is. You do, however, know who the agent is, and they are authorised in some way. So we'll call them a regulated agent. Now, the story here is that if you have this sort of situation, then you can rely on the screening that's undertaken by the regulated agent, and therefore there's no reason to further screen at the airport, unless there are particular issues that have arisen. And then we go right back to the start of the export supply chain, and we have the third scenario. We know who the shipper is, they're compliant. We know who the agent is, they're compliant. And in this situation, you can have an arrangement whereby you rely on the systems and procedures of the known shipper, and as long as they stay within that secure supply chain, they can be loaded onto the aircraft without any further screening. So when we were looking at the AEO, as far as customs was concerned, we said, here we have ICAO, here we have the Office of Transport Security, looking at issues from an air cargo security point of view. But there are other agencies that are involved in this as well. And in Australia and many other countries, we have the Department of Agriculture, which is concerned with export safety of foodstuffs. They want to ensure that any foodstuffs that leave the country not only meet the requirements of Australia, but they also meet the requirements of the country into which they're being imported. And that's to ensure that there's an ongoing market viability. Otherwise, you send contaminated food overseas, you lose the contract. So this was happening. But if you have a look at the square, we'll say these are the sorts of criteria, these are the sorts of issues that a company has to demonstrate that they meet in terms of security in order to get that authorisation from agriculture. And then along comes transport security, and they say, well, we've got quite a number of criteria that you need to meet. And so they go through the process again. But it doesn't stop there, because customs comes along and they say, well, we've got this program called an AEO or a Trusted Trader program, and we want you to demonstrate all these things. So the companies are saying, well, we've already done this for agriculture. We've already done it for transport security. Now, some of the issues that customs is interested in aren't exactly the same as for agriculture and transport security, but there's a lot of overlap. So one of the issues that came up from the industry was that if you're going to introduce an AEO program, can you please recognise the status that we already hold with the other agencies? So the application process might go something like, do you have accreditation with agriculture? Yes. Do you have accreditation with transport security? Yes. Okay, go to question 73, because that should be accepted on face value if and only if all government agencies are working together, which is a topic of another discussion someday. Free trade agreements, there's also a lot of talk about including the concept of AEO and mutual recognition in free trade agreements. This is an extract from the EU-Singapore agreement where they're looking at exactly that. There is an expectation that at some stage the two countries will negotiate a mutual recognition agreement to take account of their respective AEO programs. In terms of the research findings, I guess it's taken as read that a trader is likely to face more delays and costs if they're not recognised as a low risk in the country to which they're being exported. And the SAFE framework has actually changed quite subtly but quite significantly since it was first introduced in 2005. What it now says, used to talk about customs being sort of neutral in terms of their assessment of risk management. And if for some reason there was a reason to consider that this consignment should be high risk, then it was high risk. Otherwise, it would be sort of middle of the road. If there was an understanding that goods were low risk, they were low risk. But again, the bulk of the transactions with which customs was dealing with were considered to be neutral, if you like, in terms of risk. The new SAFE framework says that the definition of high risk is the cargo for which there is inadequate information or reason to deem it as low risk. So in other words, if it's not low risk, it is automatically high risk. There's nothing in the middle. So we're getting to the stage where there is a concept of an authorised supply chain. If you're exporting through a secure supply chain, if the members of the supply chain are authorised economic operators, your goods will be considered low risk. If they're not, they will be considered high risk. Interestingly, New Zealand, when they negotiated their mutual recognition agreement with the US, indicated to their AEOs that if you're in our program, your goods are 3.5 times less likely to be inspected in the US than for those goods that are not part of the AEO program. So they came up with some specific figures, and the US backed them up on that. It was clear that if there was no AEO scheme, there could be no mutual recognition scheme. Therefore, Australian exporters could be disadvantaged. But it was also clear that because of that, any export scheme had to focus on supply chain security. Whereas in terms of the imports, the main focus could be on trade compliance. There still needs to be an element of both trade compliance and security in both, but the balance is different. The immediate need was to introduce an AEO program. There was a resounding agreement from industry that service providers should also be included in the potential membership of AEOs. And there was an opportunity for small and medium enterprises who probably wouldn't become AEOs. If we go back to the ICAO model, if their systems and procedures are such that they export their goods through a registered agent, then that's their conduit into a secure supply chain. And that's a way of actually recognising the exports of SMEs. There were quite a number of other issues which were raised, including things like cross-agency recognition of the status, which I've just spoken about. And another thing they said was, if we're going to self-assess, we really don't want customs to check everything 100%. Where's the risk management in that? If we've been compliant for 20 years and we put in a self-assessment application for AEO, are they really going to check everything 100%? There's the usual benefits that the industry identified. They said if a scheme was introduced, this is what we'd like. But one thing that they did raise that haven't been included in other programs is when an importer or an exporter goes for a ruling with customs, and there's supposed to be a 2-week turnaround, and that 2-week turnaround turns out to be 8-month turnaround, they don't feel that's much of a trade facilitation. So they're saying if we're AEOs, we would like a guaranteed turnaround on any applications for valuation rulings or tariff rulings, etc. Recent developments, I'm pleased to say that Australian Customs has decided to introduce an AEO scheme. Hopefully we played a small part in that. Bryce Canolan is here from Australian Customs and he's going to be looking after the introduction of that scheme. And of course mutual recognition agreements are going to be included. This, though, is very important because the WTO agreement on trade facilitation now is going to bring in this concept of AEO into the GATT law, and so there's going to be dispute resolution procedures, and it's not going to be the soft law that currently exists. And that, in 15 minutes, is an overview. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. In fact, when I read out the CV that was provided to me of you, I would have liked to, I have abuse of my position now as chairman to add to this. The topic, the heading of this conference, the Bali issue, you were also involved at the very beginning with the assessment methodology that was developed with World Bank and WTO and also UNCTAD and others. And we met, I think, first time when you were starting to develop that methodology. And still today, what many of us are doing in trying to analyze the gap, there's the WTO agreement and there's each country's situation still benefits from this first methodology that you worked on. So congratulations on this too, to complement your CV.